to speed that up a lot. When you harvest greens like this, there's kind of an ideal size, but there's a range that you can go for. So if you're doing like salad mix and baby greens, this size right here is pretty dangerous. About another 2 days and this would actually be ready to harvest. If you do young harvests on it, you can get a lot more harvests out of this one. It's very thin cut of it. But if you're doing baby greens, it's much harder to do if you have drip line, because the drip line keeps this suspended. You probably have to hold it another ½ inch above the bed, and it's not so easy to pull the drip out of the bed and put it back in. If you have to do dense planting, you're not going to be able to get that drip back down in between the crops. So this is kind of getting more toward the size of, like, you might even harvest these and sell them as a grazing green, but it doesn't always line up with your harvest days, the maturity of the crop. And so this is kind of a good example of if you know it was too young last week, but you ended up having to wait the whole week. And so the way that I'm going to do this is I'm going to basically go quite a bit higher. So I'm going to be trying to miss most of these stems and cut this so that you can still eat this more or less like a salad. Let's see, we'll start up with this one.
Did you notice any change in the difference in the quality hand harvesting versus using this tool?
Hand harvesting, you'll have a higher quality. Not necessarily on the first harvest though. The first harvest, this does a really, really nice clean harvest. Successive harvests, they can look amazing, but it comes with time and practice. Because what ends up happening is if your bed's not nice and flat and you start to go with this and you can't actually see the soil surface as you're going along. So if it raises up, all of a sudden you've just terminated some crops or you've cut them really low at the soil, and all of a sudden if it drops down again, you've cut them high. And then when they grow back, the ones that actually had more vegetation left on them, they're going to grow faster. And it becomes really difficult to find that sweet spot where you don't accidentally cut the old stems from the past harvest. So if your bed's nice and smooth, you can always find that, push it down, find the spot, and just start going. And then every week that you go, if you do it the same way, you'll be right above those past stems. And so at this point in time, as long as we don't have weird inclement like weather conditions, I can get very nice looking harvests at least for 3 times, but there definitely is a small degradation in that quality with each harvest after the first.
I was thinking of those things hitting the leaves, and
never had any problems with that. Yeah, it's
okay.
They're soft enough and it's less aggressive than it looks. Basically, it bops them and they just fly right in. You'll notice a few things while I do this. If you have a very dense planting and you're able to go right at the soil surface, when you do it, it actually kind of like builds up this pile inside of here until you stop before it dumps back. If it's a loose planting, then what will happen is as it hits it and cuts it, it'll throw it into the bag and you'll see a lot more of it getting whipped out of the bag, which can be a bit of a pain because any of this stuff that flies out lands on the bed and gets left behind. Some people actually will come through with a leaf blower afterward to knock all of that, the loose greens off of the bed so that it doesn't rot in there and be part of your next harvest. There's a few different ways to do this. I'm going to kind of go about it the way that I would do it myself. So this is basically what I'd be looking at if maybe I did my first harvest and my first harvest didn't go very well, and so I decided I wanted to let it grow a little bit extra so that I wouldn't be nicking all those bad leftover stems from the last one. And so with my 30-inch beds, I come 2 passes. I'll pass on this half of the bed, and then the way I used to do it is I'd go up to where I wanted to stop my harvest, about half a bin, and then I'd turn around and I'd come the opposite way. The way that I've been doing it recently is I just start from this side, I'll do a section, I'll dump it in there, and then I'll do the next section. And if it's not too full, I'll actually take this, I'll tip it back, and I'll go again. and you'll see how I do it here. Just like that, you get it nice and full. Another thing to consider when you're dumping out a bag like this, if it's windy out, it can be a mess. And so you kind of have to set yourself up in a way that the wind's going to be blowing toward the bag, and you drop it in like this so that it can kind of fall down in there. If you go the opposite direction, you're going to lose half your bag in the field. So you can see there, it gives a pretty nice uniform cut, and when the blade's sharp, it usually doesn't leave too much stuff behind like this. What we're seeing right now is that since there was recent rain, the vegetation is kind of heavy and laying over, and so it'll miss stuff like this occasionally. And you can come back in like at the end of your harvest, and what I'll do occasionally, if I want to clean it up, make sure that it's nice for the next harvest, these will end up standing up later in the day, and I'll just come back and I'll just give them a trim. One other thing that I forgot to mention, which is a little bit of a downside with this, is that the middle of the bed usually harvests great, but the edges of the bed where there isn't as much support, you'll see that they kind of droop over into the walkway. I used to come through and I'd hold this at an angle, and I'd bring these, cut off that edge, and harvest it as well. These days I just leave it behind, and it just helps the crop to grow back faster because there's a little bit more photosynthesis. But so that's a little bit of a downside, is it's not great at getting that, and the reason that I stopped cutting the side stuff is it's way too easy to accidentally scoop and like hit the soil, and the soil will dull this blade really, really fast. So I'm hitting a kind of a dense spot here, and sometimes you have to kind of tease this thing through it.
So you can still harvest it if the crop is wet?
It's hard. It's more difficult for sure. If it were more wet than this, it'd probably be laying down a lot more, and I tend to see if I could wait a little bit for it to dry out and stand up. The other downside is this little serpentine belt on the side. If it gets too wet, it'll start slipping, and as your harvester starts to age and get a little bit older, this belt will stretch out, and if it gets wet, it'll slip off in the field, and it's pretty annoying to have to be putting this back together while you're trying to get out of the sun and get your crops out of the sun as fast as possible. So as you advance along, if the crop were not as big as this, what I'd actually do, when I'm harvesting in my field, I have two totes, two identical totes, and one that I have painted, and I use them as a drag tote. And so I have them designed for field contact, and then the inner one is just for the produce contact, so that I don't, have any kind of contamination. It's not a necessity, but when I do that, I'll actually just take this thing behind me and drag it along. If I'm out there, the way that I used to do it, and a lot of other farmers do it, they don't use drag totes. And if this crop is smaller and kind of less leggy than this, then you can actually take it, and a lot of people will just rest it on the bed as they go along and just bring it behind them to keep this tote from getting like muddy from the soil. There's a farm, I don't know if you guys follow any farms on like YouTube or anything like that. Clay Bottom Farm. I forget where they're at, but he took his and he modified it and extended the handle so that he didn't have to bend over. And I was thinking about doing that with my own, because Farmer's Friend actually ended up working with him, and they've you can now get an addition to your tool for that exact purpose. If I have a nice perfect bed, that would be amazing, but I find that when you grow it outdoors, he does a lot of his stuff inside of like his hoop houses, and then he has this area that I forget what he calls it, but it's basically like this ultra low profile like shade structure. He basically has a wooden frame built on the ground that surrounds all of his beds, some metal cables that go between it, and he uses a pool cover reel with a large piece of agribon, and he actually rolls it out over the entire field, and it suspends it over the crop so that he can have like really pristine beds. So if you're getting really nice pristine growth like that, then probably works great with that handle. But if it starts to get kind of goofy and gets dense, if this thing starts to get caught inside of the greens, it helps to have like a lot more control over this by being closer instead of having like a really long lever where this thing would be rocking around. So fortunately, you guys have done pretty good. There aren't very many weeds in here. But you'd see if there were weeds, what I do in my field, if I have a planting where maybe I followed up a crop that I had in the ground for a long time and I had like a little bit more weed seeds, then what I'll do is I'll actually go through the bed, and as I harvest it, I'll watch for weeds. If I see one ahead of me, I'll just go ahead and pop it out of the ground so that I don't scoop it in there. The further along you get in your process and those weeds actually like get into the wash station, the more likely they're going to make it into your bags that go to your customers. And so I'll scoop. If I miss them while I'm in the field, I'll come back over here and I'll just take a quick peruse over it, and I'll just pick out the weeds as I go along. But fortunately, this is a pretty clean planting.
Yeah, the weed pressure on this side that grew so well is so much less than on the other side. We have gone through and hand weeded a lot over here, but just it shaded out the weeds so fast over there. So we didn't actually have to do that much weeding. Maybe just like one time going through really quickly. But really the greens took care of it. The other side is a different story.
So you can see here, you can kind of throw these sometimes, and you can have problems with your crop if too much of this gets left behind, and it basically, these things dehydrate, they stick all over your fresh greens, and then you can have mildew problems or photosynthesis and get like yellow leaves. But that's that. If we were able to have timed this just a little bit better and we got this at just the ideal time, what would be left behind is probably about 1 to 1.5 inches of stem and some of the most recent leaves that had just sprouted off of these stems. And the main thing that I would do under those circumstances, I don't think I want to hit this one yet because it'll be probably mess some stuff up and I end up scraping the soil here. But like I was saying before, I come down here, I just touch it to the soil, lift it up just a little bit, and I start going. I forgot what I was even saying. Anyway, yeah. Basically, it would end up being nice and flush, and it would just look freshly trimmed, almost like you went over it with a lawnmower.
If you wanna trim down this stuff a little further, just to show what that might look like, you know,
Yeah.
we just grew it for this demonstration.
Okay, so yeah, I'll knock it down a little bit. It might not go as well because once they get bigger like this, you see some of these stems are like real thick, so it might push them over instead of cutting them. But I'll kind of give you an example of how low it might go.
Yeah, we don't have to do the whole thing or anything. Just
Yeah.
Do you find that mulching too close to the bed is problematic for your post-harvest as well?
Unfortunately, I don't have any experience with that. At our farm, we were recommended to not mulch next to the beds because we had like major slug issues, and they love to hide inside the mulch. The last 2 seasons, we don't have slugs anymore. Like they're almost just like non-existent, and so I've been dabbling with it, but I haven't really gotten into it after I kind of like created my standard protocol, you know. So I'd come out here, I drop this down, touch it down, lift it up, and just start going. And the thing that you have to consider when you do this is you need to look at the actual size of these, and you need to determine what height you're going to try to hold it at, because if you look at these, like this one's kind of a good example. Its most tender and young growth was right here in the center, and I went down low enough that I terminated that, so this will have terminated this entire plant. And so sometimes these will grow, they won't be quite uniform, especially when you have mixes like this. Certain varieties will grow faster in here, and so if I were to just come down here and go, okay, here's the height I'm going, let's rock and roll, you might go to your next harvest and find out that like all of the Mizuna got terminated, and so Mizuna is no longer part of that mix. But that's about what it would look like. It's leaving it behind a little bit more than normal. This is what you might actually see if the blade were a little bit dull, but we're just seeing this right now because they're particularly long. How's that?
yeah, that feels good. You guys want to go back into the shade for a minute and we'll talk any questions we have?